It wasn't the suffocating Arizona heat that was stealing the breath from Redemption Creek on July 24th, 1885. It was the silence, the kind of thick, heavy silence that follows a promise being broken in front of God and everyone. Inside the town's only church sat Daphne Clayton, a bride in white, her future vanishing with every tick of the clock. Her groom, a man who promised her the world was gone. But this isn't just a story of a runaway groom. It's the story of what happens when a void is filled by the most unlikely of men, and a day of humiliation becomes the first chapter in a saga of conspiracy danger and a love forged not in promise, but in peril. The air in the Redemption Creek Community Church was a thick, unmoving blanket, woven from dust motes, wilting wildflowers, and the collective sweat of 24 anxious souls. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down with a fury that bleached the very color from the sky. But inside, a different kind of heat was rising, the slow-baking misery of public humiliation. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then it was 1:15. Daphne Clayton kept her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. She told herself she was praying, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, her mind was a frantic ledger of calculations. The train from Prescott was due at 10:30. It was a 3-mile ride from the station to town. Even if Lawrence's horse had thrown a shoe, even if he'd stopped to rescue a child from a well, he should have been here an hour ago. Lawrence Bishop. His name had been a melody in her thoughts for 6 months. He was everything this dusty, hard-scrabble town was not polished educated, with a smile that spoke of East Coast breeding and a portfolio of land surveys that promised wealth and stability. He hadn't courted her with clumsy poems or sweaty-palmed dances at the saloon hall. He had courted her father, Franklin Clayton, first. He'd spoken of irrigation plans for Franklin's general store, of connecting Redemption Creek to larger trade routes. He'd painted a future so bright it had blinded them all, especially Daphne. Her father, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the surrounding mesas, sat stiffly in the front pew. His knuckles were white where he gripped the hymnal. He had been skeptical of Lawrence at first, calling him too much polish and not enough grit. But Lawrence's meticulous plans and apparent sincerity had worn him down. Now Franklin's jaw was set so tight, Daphne feared his teeth might crack. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the empty space beside the altar, where his future son-in-law was supposed to be his gaze, a smouldering coal of fury. 1:20. The whispers started soft as the rustle of a snake in dry leaves. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, fanned herself with a ferocity that belied her pious expression, her eyes darting between Daphne and the church doors. Young men who had once tried to court Daphne now shuffled their feet, a mixture of pity and a cruel sort of vindication on their faces. She was the school teacher, the one who read books from Boston and corrected their grammar. She had aimed higher than any of them, and now she was about to fall further than they could imagine. Daphne's dress, a beautiful thing, of ivory cotton and lace her mother had worn, began to feel like a shroud. The corset, which had felt so wonderfully snug and bridal that morning, was now a cord squeezing the air from her lungs. She could feel a tremor starting in her hands, a cold dread seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the heat. 1:30. Reverend Miller, a kind man with a face full of gentle worry, padded over to her. "Daphne, my child," he began, his voice a low rumble of sympathy. Perhaps there's been a wire, A delay. But they both knew there was only one telegraph office, and it was run by Franklin's cousin. There had been no wire. "He's coming." Daphne said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. She said it not because she believed it, but because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. The alternative was that Lawrence Bishop, the man who had quoted poetry to her by moonlight and promised her a life in a fine house in San Francisco, had simply not bothered. That he had made a fool of her and of her father. At the back of the church, leaning against the rough-hewn rear wall, stood a man no one had paid much mind to. He wasn't a guest. He was just there. Cole Corrigan. He was a drifter, some said. A ranch hand for hire, others claimed. He'd been in town for a few months, mostly keeping to himself, earning his keep by breaking wild horses and doing odd jobs too tough or too dangerous for anyone else. He was a man of few words and a steady, unnerving gaze. He watched the scene unfold, not with the morbid curiosity of the other townsfolk, but with a quiet, analytical stillness. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was unreadable, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. The tremble in Daphne's hands, the vein pulsing in her father's temple, the predatory glint in the eyes of the gossips. He had seen Lawrence Bishop in town a few times. He'd seen the way the man's eyes, never quite settled, always scanning, assessing. He'd seen the expensive boots that had never known a day's real work, and the soft hands of a man who dealt in paper, not in calluses. Corrigan had a nose for trouble, and Lawrence Bishop had smelled like a flash flood in a dry canyon. 1:45. A small sob escaped Daphne's throat, a sound she couldn't contain. It was the crack in the dam. The humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. She saw her future not as a fine house in San Francisco, but as poor Daphne, the jilted bride. She would have to face her students. She would have to endure the pitying looks and the "I told you so" smirks for the rest of her days in this town. Her father would be seen as a dupe, a man easily swindled by a smooth tongue. The shame was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. Franklin Clayton stood up. His face was a thundercloud. "That's enough," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent church. "This wedding is over. My daughter will not be made a spectacle of." He strode toward Daphne, his intention clear to lead her out away from the prying eyes. But as he took her arm, Daphne looked at the sea of faces, and a spark of something other than shame flickered within her. It was defiance, pure, unadulterated anger. Lawrence Bishop would not ruin her. He would not turn her into a tragedy. But how the wedding was a public declaration. Its failure was just as public. The damage was done. Reverend Miller wrung his hands. "Franklin, please." As the Clayton family stood on the precipice of a full-blown social catastrophe, a voice cut through the tension from the back of the church. It was low, calm, and carried a surprising weight of authority. "Reverend." Every head turned. Cole Corrigan pushed himself off the wall and took a slow, deliberate step forward. His worn leather vest and dusty jeans were a stark contrast to the wedding finery, but he moved with an unhurried grace. All eyes were on him. He walked down the central aisle, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic jingle-jangle on the wooden floorboards, the only sound in the church. He stopped a few feet from the altar, his gaze directed not at the crowd, but at Daphne. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time that day, she felt seen as a person, not a prop in a drama. He tipped his hat slightly. "Ma'am, Reverend," he said, his voice even. "It seems there's a wedding planned and a bride waiting." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "If the lady's still in need of a groom, I'll stand." The collective gasp was like the wind being sucked out of the room. Franklin Clayton looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Mrs. Gable actually dropped her fan. Daphne stared at the stranger, this quiet, dusty man with storm cloud eyes, and her mind went utterly, blessedly blank. He was offering her a way out, an insane, unthinkable, terrifying way out. But a way out nonetheless. It was a choice between two public humiliations, being the abandoned bride or the one who married a stranger in dusty boots. In that moment, staring into Cole Corrigan's steady gaze, Daphne Clayton made a choice. It wasn't about love or hope or forever. It was about survival. The silence that followed Cole Corrigan's offer was a different beast entirely from the one that had preceded it. The first was born of absence. This new one was born of shock. It was so absolute that Daphne could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. "What in God's name are you talking about?" "Boy." "Franklin." Clayton finally roared, stepping between Cole and his daughter like a bear defending its cub. "This is my daughter's wedding, not a damned circus. Get out of this church." Cole didn't flinch. His gaze remained on Daphne. "Your daughter's wedding was set for this afternoon, Mr. Clayton. The groom didn't show. That much is plain. What's also plain is that every tongue in this territory will be wagging about it before sunset. They'll call her pitiful. They'll say you were made a fool of." He spoke the hard truths without malice, stating them as simple facts. I'm offering a different story for them to tell. The one where she wasn't abandoned, but where she made a choice. His logic was cold, sharp, and brutally correct. It cut through the emotional chaos and appealed to the one thing Daphne had left her pride. She looked past her furious father at Cole. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no opportunistic gleam. There was an understanding. It was the look of a man who knew what it was to have your back against a wall. "Daphne." "Do not entertain this madness," her father hissed, but Daphne was already moving. She lifted the hem of her ivory dress and stepped around her father, placing herself directly in front of Cole. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He smelled of leather dust and something clean and wild like pine after a rain. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know me." "I know what I see," he replied, his voice just as low. "I see a woman who spent a month helping rebuild the schoolhouse roof after the storm, not waiting for a man to do it. I see the person who reads to old Mr. Abernathy, since his eyes went bad. I don't see a woman who deserves to be turned into a cautionary tale." He paused. "Besides, I've got my own reasons." The last sentence hung in the air, a hint of a deeper story she couldn't begin to guess. But it was the first part that struck her. He had been watching. He had been paying attention. In 6 months, Lawrence had praised her beauty and her grace. In a few moments, this stranger had seen her character. She took a deep breath, the corset fighting her all the way. She was standing at a fork in the road of her life. One path led back to a life of quiet spinsterhood, forever marked by this day's shame. The other was a leap into an unknown so vast it terrified her. But it was a leap forward, not backward. "Reverend Miller," she said, her voice finding a sudden surprising strength. "We have a groom." "Daphne, no," Franklin bellowed. "Father," she said, turning to him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "Mr. Bishop is not coming. That is a fact. My reputation and yours will be in tatters. This is a solution. A temporary one, perhaps, but it is a shield. Please." Reverend Miller looked from Daphne's determined face to Franklin's apoplectic one, then to Cole's stoic calm. He was a man of God, but also a practical man who understood the brutal social mechanics of a small town. He sighed a great gust of resignation. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he muttered, sounding profoundly unconvinced. "Very well. Let us proceed." The ceremony was the strangest, most hollow ritual imaginable. Cole stood at the altar, his dusty boots firmly planted. Daphne joined him, a gulf of a few inches between them, feeling like a mile-wide canyon. She could feel the stares of the townsfolk burning into her back. The vows were a blur of words she barely registered. When it came time for the rings, she slipped the simple gold band meant for Lawrence onto Cole's finger. It was too small, stopping at his knuckle. He had no ring for her. He simply took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. His touch was firm, dry, and surprisingly warm. It was the most real thing she'd felt all day. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, just a brief, searching look between them, before Cole nodded curtly. "It's done," he said, as if confirming the completion of a contract. The walk out of the church was an ordeal. The whispers were now a low, humming roar. Daphne kept her chin high, her eyes forward, focusing on the blindingly bright rectangle of the open doorway. Cole walked beside her, a solid, silent presence. He didn't touch her, but she was acutely aware of him, a bulwark against the waves of shock and disapproval. Once outside in the punishing sun, Franklin cornered them. "What have you done, Daphne? Married a drifter, a man with no name, no prospects." "He has a name," Daphne retorted, though she realized with a jolt that was all she truly knew. "And he saved yours." Before the argument could escalate, Cole stepped in. "Mr. Clayton, your daughter has had a long day. We'll be heading over to the boarding house to collect my things. Then we'll sort out Lawrence Bishop." The name spoken aloud broke the spell of the wedding. The mystery of the groom's disappearance was now their shared problem. "What's there to sort out?" Franklin grumbled. "The coward ran." "Good riddance. Cowards run." Cole said, his eyes scanning the street, but they usually run with their bags packed. "I think a look at his room at the hotel is in order." Sheriff Brody, a portly man who preferred his job to be quiet and uneventful, waddled over, mopping his brow. "Now hold on, Corrigan. This is official business. No need for civilians to get involved." "We're hardly civilians," Sheriff Daphne said the word "we," feeling foreign and strange on her tongue. "Mr. Bishop was my fiancé. This man is my husband. I'd say we have a vested interest." Sheriff Brody blinked, overwhelmed by the sheer irregularity of the situation. He reluctantly agreed, and the small, strange party, the jilted father, the newlywed strangers, and the bewildered sheriff made their way to the Redemption Hotel. Lawrence's room was on the second floor. The door was unlocked. The moment they stepped inside, they knew something was wrong. It wasn't just empty. It was violently disordered. Drawers were pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor. The mattress was slashed open, stuffing spilling out like cottony guts. A valise was overturned, its fine linen shirts and trousers trampled underfoot. "Looks like someone was in a hurry," Sheriff Brody stated with an impressive grasp of the obvious. "Or looking for something," Cole corrected him, his eyes sharp and methodical as he scanned the chaos. He moved with a purpose the sheriff lacked, not disturbing the scene, but absorbing every detail. Daphne stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. This wasn't a man who had simply left. This was the room of a man whose departure was unplanned and violent. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. What if he hadn't abandoned her? What if something terrible had happened? Cole knelt by the fireplace, where a small pile of ashes lay on the hearth. He poked at them gently with a penknife. Most of it was just paper, but he carefully teased out a few larger, unburnt fragments. On one, Daphne could just make out the edge of a map with hand-drawn lines and what looked like surveyor's marks. On another was a corner of a ledger page with a column of numbers and a few cryptic letters: WC, Deed, JK. "What is that?" she asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," Cole said, his voice grim. But Lawrence Bishop wasn't just a fancy land surveyor from back east. He was into something else. Something worth tearing this room apart for. He looked from the burnt papers to the ransacked room, then to Daphne. "And I'm betting whatever it is, he didn't just leave you at the altar." He was stopped. In that moment, standing in the wreckage of the life she thought she wanted. Daphne realized her wedding day wasn't over. The humiliation in the church had just been the prelude. The real story, a story of secrets and danger, was only just beginning. And the stranger she had just married held the only key. The days following the wedding were a study in tension. Cole moved his meager belongings, a saddle, a bedroll, a rifle, and a small wooden box, into the spare room of the small house behind her father's general store where Daphne lived. They were husband and wife, in name only two strangers, orbiting each other in a space too small for their secrets. The town watched, of course. Every trip Daphne made to the schoolhouse, every time Cole crossed the street to the stables, was noted and dissected. But the narrative had shifted. She was no longer poor, jilted Daphne. She was Daphne Corrigan, the woman who had made an audacious choice, now married to the quiet, capable man who was investigating the disappearance of her former fiancé. It was scandalous, but it wasn't pitiful. Their evenings were spent in the parlor, the burnt map fragments and ledger page laid out on the table between them under the flickering lamplight. The silence was thick, but it was a working silence now. J.K. Daphne mused, tracing the letters on the charred paper. It could be anyone. John Kramer. Joseph Knight. Too many to guess. Cole set his focus on the map. "This is the important part." He pointed to the surveyor's lines. "These marks aren't for any known property lines. They're marking something else. And this WC, it's written next to a symbol for a water source." Daphne leaned in closer, her mind trained to find patterns in literature and history, now searching for them in these cryptic clues. WC. "Whispering Creek," she said, a sudden realization dawning. "It's on our land. My father's land. It's a small tributary that runs along the northern edge of our property. Most people don't even know it's there. It's the only water source in this valley that doesn't run dry by late summer." Cole looked up from the map, his stormy eyes meeting hers. The pieces were starting to click into place, and the picture they were forming was ugly. In this territory, Daphne, a man who controls the water, controls everything. The land, the cattle, the town itself. Suddenly, Lawrence Bishop's courtship made a terrifying kind of sense. His interest in her father, his talk of irrigation and trade routes. It wasn't about building a future for Redemption Creek. It was about gaining control of its lifeline. Marriage to her would have given him a legal claim, or at the very least, intimate access to the Clayton deed. So he was a con man, Daphne said the words, feeling hollow. He was after the land. And whoever J. Case is was his partner, Cole added. Or his boss. And when Bishop disappeared, they got desperate. They tore his room apart, looking for whatever paperwork he had, the deed maybe, or a bill of sale he'd tricked your father into signing. A new wave of anger, cold and clear, washed away the last vestiges of her hurt. She hadn't just been jilted. Her family had been targeted. Jasper Kane, she said the name coming to her lips unbidden. Cole's head snapped up. Why him? He's the biggest rancher in the territory. He's been trying to buy out smaller homesteaders for years, including my father. He's ruthless, and his initials are J.K. Cole stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. Kane. It fits. He has the money, the power, and he's greedy enough to bleed this valley dry. He turned back to her, a shadow crossing his face. And he's dangerous. More dangerous than a simple swindler like Bishop. The next day, against her father's strenuous objections, they decided to ride out to Whispering Creek. Daphne insisted on coming. It's my family's land, she said, her chin set in a stubborn line that reminded Cole of her father. I know it better than anyone. She appeared in a practical split skirt, a rifle she knew how to use strapped to her saddle. The ride was tense. The landscape grew wilder as they left the town behind the dusty plains, giving way to rocky outcrops and sparse hardy pine. Cole was different out here. In town, he was a quiet observer. In the wilderness, he was alive, his senses on high alert. He noticed a broken branch, the track of a shod horse that was days old, the distant cry of a hawk. As they neared the creek, a small green ribbon in the arid landscape, Cole suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for silence. "Get down," he whispered. Daphne slid from her saddle, her heart hammering. Cole pointed towards a cluster of boulders, 50 yards ahead near the creek bed. She could just make out 2 horses tied to a scrubby tree. A trap. Kane's men. Cole breathed his hand already on the rifle in his saddle scabbard. They must have been watching the place. Before they could retreat, a shot rang out, kicking up dust just inches from Daphne's feet. A voice bellowed from the rocks. "That's far enough." Corrigan. 2 men stepped out from behind the boulders, rifles leveled. They were hard-faced men, Daphne recognized as hands from Kane's Cross K ranch. "Kane wants a word," the first man sneered. "And the school marm. He's got a special interest in her." Cole slowly raised his hands, his face a mask of calm. "No need for trouble, boys. Just out for a ride. Your riding days are over," the second man said, stepping forward. It happened faster than Daphne could process. As the second man moved, he momentarily crossed in front of his partner. In that split second, Cole dropped, drawing the revolver from his hip in a single, fluid motion. His first shot was a deafening roar that sent the second man staggering back, clutching a wound in his shoulder. His second shot came a heartbeat later, striking the rifle from the first man's hands and sending it clattering into the rocks. It was over in 2 seconds. One man was down, groaning, and the other stood, frozen. His hands empty, staring at Cole with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Daphne stood, her own rifle half raised, her mind reeling from the speed and lethal efficiency of what she'd just witnessed. This was not the work of a simple ranch hand. This was the skill of a seasoned gunfighter. Cole kept his pistol trained on the uninjured man. "Get your friend on his horse and ride out. Tell Jasper Kane that the Clayton land is not for sale. And tell him Cole Corrigan is back." The name spoken with such cold fury hung in the air. The gunman's eyes widened further. He clearly recognized it. He scrambled to help his partner, and within minutes they were gone, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats behind. Daphne finally lowered her rifle, her hands trembling. She looked at Cole, who was calmly reloading his revolver. "Who are you?" She asked the question she'd been holding back since their wedding day. "They knew your name." "Corrigan is back," you said. Back from where Cole finished loading his gun, his movements precise and economical. He holstered the weapon and finally met her gaze. The storm clouds in his eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. "My family used to own a spread north of here, in the Verde Valley," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Biggest ranch in that county. My father was a good man, but a trusting one. He took on a new partner, a man with big ideas and a fast pen. A man named Jasper Kane." He paused, the muscle in his jaw working. "Kane used forged documents and bribed officials to systematically ruin him, bleeding the ranch dry until he could buy it for pennies on the dollar. It broke my father. He died a year later. My mother followed soon after. I was 16. I swore I'd see Kane pay for what he did, but I was just a boy. I worked cattle drives, scouted for the army, did things I'm not proud of to survive. I learned to handle a gun. I came back to this territory a few months ago, trying to find a way to get close to Kane, to find proof of his crimes." He looked at her, and now she understood the look in his eyes that first day. It wasn't just understanding, it was recognition. He had seen in her family the same vulnerability that had destroyed his own. "When I saw Lawrence Bishop sniffing around your father, so smooth and polished, I knew," Cole continued. "He was Kane's new tool. When he disappeared and you were left standing there alone, I couldn't let Kane win again. I couldn't let him do to your family what he did to mine. Marrying you. It wasn't just a shield for you, Daphne. It was a sword for me." Daphne stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle that was Cole Corrigan locking into place. Her marriage of convenience wasn't convenient at all. It was an act of vengeance. She had stepped not into a simple arrangement, but into the middle of a war that had started over a decade ago. A war for a ghost of a ranch and the memory of a ruined family. And now it was her war too. The gunshot at Whispering Creek had shattered more than just the afternoon quiet. It had shattered the fragile peace of Redemption Creek itself. The story carried back by Kane's humiliated and wounded men became the new gospel of the territory. Cole Corrigan, the quiet drifter, was now a name spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. And Daphne Corrigan, the jilted bride, was now viewed through a lens of grudging respect. She was the woman who had not only survived a public shaming, but had allied herself with the one man brave enough to stand against the shadow that loomed over their valley. Their small house behind the general store became an island of tense silence in a sea of whispers. The space that once felt awkward now felt charged thick with the unspoken knowledge of what Cole was capable of. Daphne would watch him by the lamplight, his hands cleaning his revolver with a steady, practiced calm, and she would see two men in one. There was the quiet, observant man who had noticed her reading to old Mr. Abernathy, and there was the lethal gunfighter who had moved with the speed of a striking rattler. The realization that they were one and the same was a constant, unsettling hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She wasn't frightened of him, she realized, but she was frightened for him and for the life she had been so unexpectedly thrust into. Her father, Franklin, had completed his own transformation. The apoplectic rage he'd felt in the church had been burned away, replaced by the grim focus of a man defending his kin. The shotgun he now kept, polished and ready, behind the store counter, was a clear statement. He'd misjudged Lawrence Bishop's polish and Cole Corrigan's grit, and he wouldn't make another mistake. He treated Cole not as a son-in-law, but as a commanding officer in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. 2 nights after the shootout, the 3 of them sat in the parlor. The air was heavy with the coming monsoon, the pressure a physical weight. On the table between them lay the burnt map fragments, a constant reminder of the unfinished battle. "He knows we're onto him," Cole said, breaking the long silence. His voice was low, cutting through the thick air. "He won't make the same mistake twice. Sending a pair of hired guns was clumsy. Kane's not a clumsy man. What will he do then?" Franklin asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "He'll get smarter," Cole replied, his gaze distant, focused on a strategy only he could see. "He'll try to make it look legal. He'll produce a forged deed bribe, a judge from Prescott, and have Sheriff Brody serve us with an eviction notice. He'll use the law as a weapon, and by the time we prove the fraud, his cattle will be drinking from Whispering Creek, and we'll be ruined." Daphne felt a chill, despite the oppressive heat. The image was terrifyingly plausible. "So we need our own proof," she said, her teacher's mind seeking a logical solution. Something undeniable. Something that exposes him for what he is before he can make a move. Cole's eyes met hers across the table, and in them she saw the flicker of a painful memory. Kane's arrogant. A man like that doesn't just win, he needs to gloat. He keeps trophies of his victories, reminders of how clever he is. When he ruined my father, he kept the original forged documents. I'd bet my life he still has them. Where Franklin pressed, in a safe. A big iron brute in the study of his ranch house. Cole's face was a stony mask, but Daphne could see the effort it took for him to speak of the place that held such bitter history. "I saw it on the day my father signed everything away. I was just a boy, but I never forgot it." The implication hung in the room heavy and dangerous. Daphne's heart began to hammer against her ribs. "You mean to break into his ranch house?" It wasn't a question. It's the only way Cole stated, his gaze unwavering. He looked at Daphne, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "But it's not just about papers from a decade ago. We have to consider Lawrence Bishop. Kane wouldn't have just let him ride away. A loose end like that." Not Kane's style. He was either silenced the moment his usefulness ran out, or he's being kept as leverage. A new horrifying thought bloomed in Daphne's mind, a scenario even worse than Lawrence simply being dead. "Leverage," she breathed. What if Kane is holding him, forcing him to sign a false statement to testify that my father willingly sold the land? Lawrence may be a coward and a swindler, but his signature on a document would hold up in a crooked court. The room fell silent as the full scope of their predicament settled upon them. They weren't just fighting a land grab. They were now potentially entangled in a kidnapping and possibly a looming murder. The Founders' Day celebration. Cole said suddenly, his eyes alight with a new plan. "It's in San Gabriel next week. Kane will be there. He fancies himself a political player. He'll spend the day shaking hands and the night at the rodeo. The ranch will be emptier than any other day of the year. That's our window. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal, but it was also their only chance. They spent the next few days preparing in hushed tones, the conspiracy binding them together. Franklin would take a wagon of goods out toward the Verde River, under the guise of a long picnic and some fishing, a location that would seem innocent, but was close enough to the Cross K to serve its true purpose. Daphne would go with him. Their task was the diversion. Cole's was the infiltration. When the day finally arrived, the sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. The distant sounds of celebration from San Gabriel, faint pops of firecrackers, and the murmur of a crowd drifted on the wind, a surreal counterpoint to their silent, tense mission. As dusk began to bleed across the horizon, casting long shadows from the saguaros, Cole prepared to leave. He stood before Daphne dressed in dark, practical clothes, the setting sun catching the grim determination in his eyes. "Be careful, Cole," she whispered the words, feeling hopelessly inadequate. "Your father knows what to do. When you see the ranch hands ride out toward the smoke, give me an hour. Then head straight back to town. Don't wait," he commanded softly. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, a silent communication passing between them that was more intimate than any touch they had ever shared. Then he turned and melted into the growing darkness, becoming just another shadow on the land. Daphne's hands trembled as she helped her father prepare the brush pile. The waiting was an agony. An hour after Cole had left, Franklin struck a match. The dry kindling caught instantly, and a plume of thick grey smoke began to curl into the twilight sky. It was a beacon, a calculated risk. They watched and waited, their ears straining. After 20 agonizing minutes, they heard it, the thunder of hooves, as a handful of Kane's men galloped out from the ranch to investigate the fire. The diversion had worked. "It's time," Franklin said, his face grim in the firelight. "We go now." Daphne climbed into the wagon, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Every instinct screamed for her to wait, to know that Cole was safe. But she had her orders. As the wagon rumbled away, she looked back at the vast, dark expanse of the Cross K Ranch, feeling as if she were leaving a part of herself behind in that dangerous darkness. Cole moved through the landscape with an animal's grace, his senses alive. The Cross. K Ranch was a place of ghosts for him. He could almost see his younger self running across these fields, hear his father's laughter on the wind. The memories were a sharp ache, but he pushed them down, channeling the pain into focus. He reached the sprawling adobe ranch house. It was dark, save for a single lamp left burning in a downstairs window. Just as he'd predicted, the main house was empty. He found the pantry window, its latch loose and rattling in the breeze. He worked it open with his knife slipped inside, and was immediately enveloped by the familiar scents of his childhood home floor polish, cured meats, and Kane's ever-present cigars. He moved through the house like a wraith, his boots silent on the polished floors. He found the study. It was a monument to Kane's ego, lined with books he'd never read, and trophies he hadn't earned. And behind the massive oak desk stood the safe. He knelt before it, the cold iron like a tombstone against his fingertips. He closed his eyes, summoning the memory. The clicks of the tumblers as Kane had opened it, the smug look on the man's face. The numbers came back to him, a bitter poison. His own birth date. The ultimate act of erasure, Kane claiming the very day Cole had come into the world. He turned the dial, his movements precise. Left, right, left. The final tumbler fell into place with a soft, satisfying thud. The heavy door swung open. Inside, amid stacks of currency and land titles, he found the folder. Corrigan Estate. His hands shook as he opened it. There they were, the forged deeds, the falsified debt notes that had ruined his family. A cold wave of vindication washed over him. But his search wasn't over. He found a newer file, Clayton Project. It held detailed surveys of Whispering Creek and a blank deed awaiting a signature. Then, tucked at the very back, almost hidden, he found a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a confession written in Lawrence Bishop's elegant, frantic script. It detailed the entire conspiracy, naming Jasper Kane as the mastermind who had promised him a share of the profits. At the bottom was a desperate, scrawled plea. He is holding me in the old line shack by the northern ridge. He means to kill me once the deed is signed. For God's sake, help me. Cole stared at the paper. A line shack. Not the ranch house cellar. But then he realized Kane had moved him. The confession changed everything. Lawrence was alive. He was the witness who could burn Kane's empire to the ground. Cole shoved the documents inside his shirt. He had to get to that shack. But as he silently closed the safe, a sound froze him in place. The distinct crunch of a horse's hooves on the gravel drive, moving at a fast, angry clip. It wasn't a ranch hand. It was one horse, one rider. Kane. The smoke must have made him suspicious enough to ride back from San Gabriel alone. There was no time to escape the house. Cole's mind raced. He heard the front door slam open, and Kane's heavy footsteps echo on the floorboards. Kane was cursing the incompetence of his men. Cole slipped out of the study and pressed himself into the deep shadows of the main hall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the stolen papers. He listened as Kane moved through the house, checking the rooms, his anger growing. Then the footsteps headed not upstairs, but toward the cellar door. The confession had been a lie. A plant. A trap for anyone who found it. Lawrence wasn't in some distant shack. He was here. Cole followed, descending the stone steps into the damp, cool darkness. His revolver felt heavy and solid in his hand. In the flickering light of a single lantern, the scene was laid out like a grim tableau. Lawrence Bishop, pale and beaten, was chained to a massive support beam. Jasper Kane stood over him, holding a piece of paper and a pen. It was the Clayton deed. One last chance, Bishop Kane snarled, his voice a low growl of menace. Forge the old man's signature. You've got his handwriting down perfect. Do it, and I might let you live. Refuse, and you'll be buried under this floor before morning. He won't have to, a quiet voice said from the shadows of the stairs. Kane spun around, his face a mask of disbelief, turning to pure fury. His hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. But he was too late. Cole was already at the bottom of the stairs, his own revolver leveled and steady. It's over, Jasper. Corrigan Kane breathed a cruel smile spreading across his face. The ghost. I should have known you were more than just a stable hand. You came back to haunt me. I came back for justice, Cole said, his voice as cold and hard as the stone walls around them. For my father, and for the Claytons. Justice Kane laughed a harsh, ugly sound. This is my valley. I make the justice here. You think you can stop me? You're just like your father, a sentimental fool. Behind Kane, Lawrence Bishop saw his one desperate chance. He had lived as a coward, but he would not die as one. With a strangled cry, he threw his body forward, using the slack in his chains to wrap them around Kane's ankles. The big man roared in surprise and stumbled, his balance gone. His pistol fired the shot going wild, exploding a crate of preserves against the far wall. That was the only opening Cole needed. The cellar roared with the blast of his revolver. The sound was deafening, absolute. Jasper Kane crumpled to the floor, the arrogant smirk wiped from his face forever, replaced by the blank surprise of death. The war he had started 16 years ago was finally, truly over. Cole stood over the body for a long moment, the smoke from his gun barrel curling in the lantern light. He felt not triumph, but a vast, hollow emptiness. He unchained a sobbing Lawrence Bishop just as he heard the frantic shouts of Sheriff Brody and a posse arriving outside. Franklin had done his part. When Daphne and her father burst through the door, they found Cole standing in the main hall. The damning papers in his hand, his face etched with exhaustion. Daphne's breath caught in her throat. She ran to him, heedless of the sheriff or anyone else, her hands coming up to frame his face, assuring herself he was real. He was unharmed. In that moment, in front of the whole town, their marriage ceased to be a performance. Days later, after the chaos had subsided and Lawrence Bishop had been shipped off to the territorial prison, a strange peace settled over Redemption Creek. The shadow of the cross-quay was gone. One evening, Cole and Daphne stood on the porch of the little house. The world felt quiet, remade. The lawyer from Prescott said the Corrigan estate deeds are valid. Cole said, his voice soft. He held the papers that represented his stolen birthright. The land. It's mine again. Daphne's heart constricted. Will you go back? She asked, afraid of the answer. Cole looked not at the papers, but out at the horizon where the sun was setting. That ranch is full of ghosts, Daphne. The boy I was died there with my father. I spent more than a decade chasing vengeance, thinking it was all I had left. But I was wrong. He turned to her, and the last of the storm clouds had finally cleared from his eyes, leaving only a deep, steady warmth. He took her hand. Our wedding was a contract, a shield. I told you I had my own reasons, and I did. It started as a way to fight Kane. He took a breath. But somewhere along the way, fighting for you and your father became more important than fighting for my past. Somewhere along the way, this house started to feel more like a home than my own ever did. He looked down at their joined hands. I know I'm not the life you planned. I don't have fine words or promises of San Francisco. All I have is what you see. But if you'll have me, Daphne, I'd like to stop being your husband in name only. Tears welled in Daphne's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. She thought of the man she had been supposed to marry, a phantom, who had offered a life that was a beautiful lie. Then she looked at the man before her, a man of grit and substance, who had walked through fire for her. Her planned life had been a mirage. This life, this unexpected, tumultuous, and fiercely real life, was the truth. She tightened her grip on his hand, her touch conveying everything she couldn't yet say. Cole Corrigan. She said, her voice thick with emotion, as a true smile, radiant and new, lit up her face. I believe we have a vow to fulfill. He returned the smile, a slow, rare thing that transformed his rugged face. And there on the porch, under a sky full of stars instead of a church roof full of judging eyes, he leaned in and gently finally kissed his bride. And so the story of Daphne Clayton's disastrous wedding day became the legend of Daphne and Cole Corrigan. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes our greatest heartbreaks are merely clearing the path for our true destiny. Theirs is a story that proves that honor isn't found in fancy words or promises of wealth, but in quiet courage and steadfast loyalty. It shows that love doesn't always arrive on schedule or dressed in finery. Sometimes it walks in wearing dusty boots when you need it most ready to stand with you against the world. Their legacy wasn't built on a fraudulent deed to a piece of land, but on a foundation of shared peril, mutual respect, and a love that was truly earned. If this piece of hidden history moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a true story of the Old West. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience, romance, and redemption from the pages of the past. Let us know in the comments what part of their story resonated with you the most.